You know, I spent years and years of my life trying to figure out why churchy people were the way that they were. Because as a seeker, right, as a spiritual seeker with lots of questions, I was drawn to church. Being in the West, that's where I was led to believe the answers lived. Even though my parents were raised Catholic and rejected religion, I understood the Bible as the source of all answers and this, book of truth and wisdom. So when I got to church and was around people who'd read this book, it struck me as very strange that they had read this book of wisdom and it hadn't seemed to help. I didn't encounter anyone that I would describe as wise for quite a while. Now, there are certain church groups that I feel like are more that are less rigid and religious, and I was in some that were quite both rigid and religious. So I will say that. But I didn't discover the free thinkers with the peace and love and freedom that they talked about. The majority of people that I met were quite judgy and unhappy, or just kind of off, like confused about what life actually is. They, there was this perception, like the overarching vibe was that we all had to be good and that it was possible to be bad and that we had to try as hard as possible to be as good as we could in order to like escape our evil human nature and so that Jesus would come back and reward us and save us. I mean, call me crazy, but that never really sat right. I was sort of like, um, because I was reading this book too. I was kind of like, I mean, I can discern that there are parts of it that absolutely ring true and other parts that just don't seem to make any sense. And I additionally always thought it was weird that if you didn't grow up in the West, this would not be your dominant, like, kind of thought pattern. Like this book wouldn't be touted as the source of truth. I just remember being struck by the concept that there were all these people so excited about the prospect of Jesus coming back. And when I actually read stories in the Bible, thinking to myself, you know, you sound a lot like the people who didn't recognize him. Um, kind of less apostle and more like the people who caused his demise. And that never sat right. So, learning what I've learned and going through the journey I've gone through, I now understand that the Bible is one of an extensive body of spiritual texts that are not separated from each other. When you look at the like Vedic scripture, the Upanishad, when you look at the Tao Te Ching, any text that you read tells the same story, consistent with what the Bible tells. The problem is that the Bible has been grossly misused and egregiously misinterpreted and used to push a patriarchal agenda so aggressively that entire like swaths of people are still confused about what we are. And it's because this was taken and misused on purpose so that we wouldn't know how powerful we are, that we wouldn't know that the basis of everything is energy. And really, I mean, it came from a small number of people who wanted to control pretty much everyone. And, that I think if I had heard myself say that 5 years ago, I would have thought I was a conspiracy theorist. But that's because I had not read the Tao Te Ching or the Upanishads, and I hadn't done this exploration I've done now. So I want to talk about the spiritual teachers who blew my mind the most, who best shaped my understanding of what the Bible actually is. And that's Eckhart Tolle, Neville Goddard, and the authors of Womb Awakening, Azra Bertrand and Seren Bertrand, because what we believe societally is actually still built on what we were taught about the Bible. So Eckhart Tolle is the first one. In The Power of Now, he talks about the fact that people create a personal heaven or a personal hell, depending on what they believe. Now, when I compared this to the average person subscribed to Christianity before that I had met, um, was always so excited about some future reality. Like, oh, everything we see, we're going to hell in a handbasket, and everything we see is a gong show. But thank goodness at some point, Jesus will come back and save us all. Eckhart pokes holes in that. He talks about the fact that heaven is actually here. It's a personal reality. In the biblically misinterpreted version of events, what everyone's waiting for is a specific time, like a point in actual specific time where a person comes back to restore humanity, I guess. What do we think this means? Eckhart talks about the idea that it's such an abstract concept that we're getting excited about, we're that we're wrecking our current reality, and all we have is the current reality. It's the equivalent of working for a job that you hate in order to get a retirement fund. Like, it doesn't make sense. You're wasting your current life in order to maybe have some future, like it just doesn't add up. He talks about the fact that people will basically use religion to justify living in their heads. Like, it's almost like a form of mental illness or self-delusion where the current life is uncomfortable and people are, overthinking, overanalyzing. They can't imagine a life that's peaceful. So everything that the Bible talks about, the peace that is offered, is not interpreted through a present lens. It's interpreted as some after time, after this life. And that's incorrect, because the peace that is referred to is a current peace. It's the power of now, right? That there's only one time and it's now. But this misinterpretation of the whole scripture is like used as a vehicle, like later, a mechanism to justify overthinking now, suffering now, and in the hopes of one day being rewarded. He also talks about, and I find this really interesting, the word sin being misinterpreted also, where the origin of the word, like the word actually means to miss the point. And of course, you can't escape the deep irony there. That if to sin means to miss the point, it's super ironic that the patriarchal version of this religion has been, so consumed with avoiding sin and being terrified of that. And I mean, that is a sinful collective. That's an entire collective that's missing the point. The misunderstood version of the Bible teaches us we are not powerful and we are not creating our realities. So we're banking on a person to save us. And that brings me to Neville Goddard, who does not believe that the story of Jesus and Mary and God are about actual humans, but parts of consciousness. And this is the most interesting thing I've ever heard. So Neville doesn't believe that Jesus is actually a person who lived. Jesus is the representation of consciousness. God is the superconscious, so like the collective consciousness or the superego. Mary is the feminine subconscious, and Jesus is the conscious. So you can think of this in manifestation terms as God is the collective consciousness, like the source energy that powers everything. Mary is your subconscious, and so you're the unmanifest, the invisible. Jesus is the visible. So what appears in your physical reality or in your conscious mind? You need to get all three on board in order to be able to manifest. Now, when I was young and in the church, I had no idea what manifestation was. I did not understand that we have the power within us to create our realities. We are not randomly assigned anything, and we are also not assigned things based on whether we are quote unquote good or bad. That is the biggest mistake we've made based on what we've been mistaught about the Bible, that it's possible to be a good human or a bad human. It's possible to be at different levels of consciousness, but the good bad interpretation is like the lowest possible consciousness there is. I love what Neville, um, the way that Neville interprets the Bible, because he describes this as basically it's not a story about one person coming to save humans, one person who is both God and human at the same time. It's the story of all humans being God and human at the same time, coming to saving themselves, basically coming to consciousness and realizing that they've had this power all along, this power that we've been taught to worship in another person, like in a figure in Jesus. It basically turns into idol worship, which hilariously is like a no-no. Um, you know, this power that we have gets displaced. We get separated from it when we believe the misinterpreted version of the Bible. And that's super dangerous. It keeps us from coming to what's referred to as Christ consciousness, where Christ is not a person, but a level of consciousness. It's accessible to all of us at any time. Hilariously, the Bible is a set of instructions about how to manifest, how to live a beautiful life. And it's the story of consciousness, of someone coming to consciousness, or all of us coming to consciousness. It's been egregiously misunderstood. He also talks about the fact that the Bible was written in an Eastern tradition, and when we interpret it through a Western lens, we don't understand the stories. Every single parable is figurative, and Eckhart does this too. He interprets stories in the Bible and explains them as parts of consciousness. Now, Womb Awakening was the book that opened my eyes to the fact that, see, I don't think it's important. I don't actually think it's important to know whether Jesus lived or not. I think that whether Jesus is a form of consciousness or is a form of consciousness represented by a person who lived and taught, I think I'm more to that side, but I don't draw any hard lines. I think that what his teaching represents is not changed by whether he lived or not. I think that what the story teaches us is the most important, not knowing, where we stand. But that's just me. That's just my opinion. Personally, I do believe that Jesus lived, but I don't believe we understand at all what that meant. Because in Womb Awakening, Azra and Seren talk about Jesus' relationship with Mary Magdalene. So in like patriarchal Christianity, Mary Magdalene is talked about as uh not very nice words. like she's not given a position of power, which whether a part of consciousness or an actual physical human, she was exceptionally powerful. She was reportedly the only person who actually understood Jesus' teachings, which I think is hilarious because I can 1000% see how that was true. In a society, and we see this when most people are at a low level of consciousness and someone is there, talking about very high vibrational ideas, they don't match with the majority of people. There's only a few people, who can vibe with those ideas. Most people aren't going to understand. And that's a perfect illustration, Mary Magdalene. But in Womb Awakening, they talk about Jesus' relationship with Mary being one of initiation into womb wisdom. Now, this is getting a little bit out there for the uninitiated, but basically, The womb is the source of all life. Whether we're talking about a physical womb inside a body or the allegorical cosmic womb of creation, everything comes from a place that's invisible and then it becomes visible. And that process is called manifestation. Whether you're looking at creation as coming from a physical womb or an energetic, allegorical womb, it doesn't change the fact that the womb is the source of everything. And a lot of what was recorded in the Bible appear to be Jesus doing rebirthing rituals with Mary Magdalene. If you've never heard of rebirthing, to break it down very simply, is basically dying to your old state of consciousness and allowing a new state of consciousness to come through. This is what happens on the spiritual journey. Anybody doing the work has experienced this. You go through ego death, you are effectively a new person. You go through ego death again, you're effectively a new person. Some people live their lives on a linear line where they're born once and then they die. That's it. In between are all the things that they feel they're supposed to do in their life, but they really only live at one level of consciousness. This is why age doesn't equate maturity. Like, you see people who become old, but they don't become wise. Aging is an inevitability. Attaining wisdom is a choice. If we're talking about rebirth, then the story of Jesus' resurrection, it's not about the death of the body. It's about the death of a consciousness and rising to new levels of consciousness. The Bible also shows that you can't convince anyone who won't be convinced. Like, if somebody takes this story literally and applies that to their whole life, that is completely their prerogative. But I really would have appreciated knowing this information earlier. So, and I find this all very mind-blowing and freeing, frankly. So the womb religions actually predate Christianity, or what we understand as Christianity, because Christianity is patriarchal. It's the distortion of the creation story to make it male, which again is hilarious because we all come from a womb. All of us. So the womb religions were pushed out when Christianity was basically invented because there was a small percentage of people who wanted to own other people. The only way they could do that was to make sure we didn't understand our power, that our consciousness creates our reality. Because when people stay connected to that, they can't be owned. They retain their personal power. And the patriarchal fathers of the Christian religion didn't want that to be the case. They didn't want anybody to know that they're not waiting for a specific point in time. They're not trying to be good so that they avoid being punished. They didn't want them to know that we are creating ourselves in every single moment. That would mean, we're not falling for their ploy. We're not buying their stuff. We're not having their children to proliferate their image of themselves. Like, it's basically like, okay, I don't know whether this was all deliberate, whether it was a genuine misunderstanding. Either way, it was a distortion, and it's led humanity to the point where we are very confused about what we are. And with the popularity of consciousness and manifestation coming back again, it's evident that this idea of a new earth is happening. And that's another Eckhart Tolle, that the new earth is the illusions we've lived under crumble. So anyway, the womb religions that predate Christianity, they were basically matriarchal societies where women were at the center because that's where life comes from. So like the moon cycles were observed, and basically there was reverence for all life. There was not this, 9 to 5 corporate, like I know it's hard to imagine a reality where that's not the case, but we basically learn history too late on purpose so that we forget that we ever lived matriarchally. It's basically like a cosmic onion. Understanding the womb as the source of life, understanding how to manifest, like these things arise from a rising consciousness. So as you become more conscious, these concepts just make sense. There's less wrestling with them. I remember like when I was at a lower level of consciousness, I'd hear about things that sounded too woo-woo. Nothing sounds woo-woo to me anymore. Like nothing. But yeah, the cosmic onion is kind of hard to unlayer and understand if you've been raised with this scary Santa conception of God, you know, do well or you'll be punished. We've been trying to be good humans for too long, when now I think we're coming to understand that we're not trying to be good humans, we're trying to be healthy humans, whole humans, happy humans. We're like coming back to integration, where we now know that to be spiritual doesn't mean the rejection of your physical body. We're bringing both back into balance. To be female doesn't mean to be feminine and never masculine. We're coming back into balance. You know, to be rich doesn't mean to be greedy. To be poor doesn't mean to be a failure. Like we're understanding the complexity of human life, including gaining the ability to unpack the stories we've been told and challenge them. Stories about ourselves, what it means to be human. Anyway, I think that's enough for today, but I want to leave you with something I read this morning. This is from the Isha Upanishad. Now, these are Vedic texts that explain how the universe works. And I loved this. Okay. This is referring to what they call the infinite whole. That is the ocean. We are the drops. As long as the drop remains separate from the ocean, it is small and weak. But when it is one with the ocean, then it has all the strength of the ocean. Similarly, so long as man believes himself to be separate from the whole, he is helpless. But when he identifies himself with it, then he transcends all weakness and partakes of its omnipotent qualities. I love it. So this is a big topic, and it's one I'm going to be unpacking over many episodes. But for now, I've mentioned the books that I referenced in the comments. So if you're interested in checking those out, I highly recommend them. They won't be right for everybody. I think it depends on where you're at and what you're looking for. But if this has resonated at all, you will for sure want to check those out. As always, you can find me on Instagram, on TikTok, and what's the other thing? Substack. Substack, I share my newsletter, Love Notes from the Universe, topics surrounding consciousness and gender and the way that society is structured. So if you've made it this far, thank you so much for sticking with me, and I hope you tune in next time.